Welcome to the Face to Face podcast, your go-to resource for living a life of vitality, wholeness, and authenticity. I am one of your hosts, Melinda Wilson.
And I'm your other host, Kathy Little. Join us as we explore deeper connection, lasting freedom, and meaningful relationships with God, others, and your true self. Let's dive in.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast.
Welcome. We're excited that you're here. We have two things we want to tell you about, actually kind of three, but there's a guest this week that's going to be really exciting, and Melinda's going to introduce him. But first of all, Dashaway ladies, we have two spots open, just two spots left. You do not want to miss this. Please join us August 15 to 17 in beautiful Lake Tahoe. You can register at dashawayweekends.com and get more information there if you need it. Also, for those of you that are interested in learning more about the Emmanuel Approach, we have our Level 1 Emmanuel Approach for Life starting on September the 18th, and it goes through the end of October. 7 weeks, live training, excellent community building, opportunity to get yourself exposed to all of the basics of the Emmanuel Approach just for your life. You don't even have to become a facilitator, but Level 1 is required for those that want to go on to Level 2 practitioner training. And if you've already done that, you can also enroll and submit an application for that. You guys, check out emmanuelinstitute.com. If you have not been to our new website, check it out. So much information there, including the school calendar and all the information that you need to make a decision on what might be best for you regarding Emmanuel training. And it's emmanuelinstitute.com with an I, Emmanuel Institute. So Melinda, please tell us about this guest because he is a friend of yours.
Yes, Suhail Stephen hails from Manitoba, Canada. Actually, he is Indian born and lived all over the world as a missionary kid. So he has a variety of worldview and eye-opening experiences from a formative age. And he actually is my teacher in my spiritual direction course. So I've been with him almost a year now, and he's really a wealth of knowledge and wisdom and very fascinating experiences. So I'm really honored to have Suhail as our guest. This will be in two parts. So this is part one, but stick around for when we introduce the second part. But why don't you just listen to this one first? Good guy, and so glad that you're here. And welcome to, and we introduce Suhail Stephen.
I am really happy to put a face with the name and the voice. So thanks for coming on, and I'm excited for the conversation today. Melinda has told me a lot about you. Melinda's given me the 411 along the way, and so I'm excited to meet you and make your acquaintance, and glad to have you as a guest on the podcast.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I'm really delighted that it worked out, and yeah, it's been great to get to know Melinda a little bit more in the context of our School of Spiritual Direction, etc. So yeah, and good to meet you too.
Let's do a quick, why is this guy even on here? And first of all, he's an incredible person. But this is Melinda speaking for those of you just listening. And if you've just listening the first time, this is Melinda. Distinctive voice from Kathy and the other guests. But I started a School of Spiritual Direction the beginning of the year with Sustainable Faith, and Suhail Stephen from Canada. And I want to get your bio because I don't know much of it except from your website. And I am absolutely fascinated to hear some of your story and how your upbringing even brought you to your cultural perspective today. But we'll get to that in a minute. But I interviewed, in a sense, about 10 different schools of spiritual direction over the course of 5 or 6 months, because I am a researcher and I didn't want to invest my time and money into anything. And so I landed at Sustainable Faith. It's they train a lot of people. It's very well known. And then had a couple conversations with other teachers within the school. But then Suhail and I contacted him, and it was just our conversation. I just said, these are some of the things I'm questioning. And you were like, all your questions are welcome. And then I also had met this one other person that went through one of our trainings that had you as a teacher. And she said he was great. And it was all these things confirming that. And then when I landed with you and heard you and met you, it was very much a confirmation of this is where I'm supposed to be. And I just appreciate, Suhail, your wisdom and insight as one who is, I guess we could call it an expert in spiritual direction and formation, spiritual formation. And I'd love to do a flyover the Enneagram, but just your innate wisdom and also the way that you share, just, and maybe that's because of your Enneagram number, but without even labeling, I appreciate the depth of your insight and wisdom on spirituality and spiritual formation. And I even want to talk about what the heck is spirituality anyway, because that word is thrown around a lot. What is spiritual? What is spirituality? What is spiritual direction? Just to give our listeners some sort of heads up on what this conversation is about. And that's where it comes from, is my being in School of Spiritual Direction. But like even beyond that, it's not about a school. It's about gleaning from your wisdom, Suhail. But I know, again, just reading from your website, just a little bit of your vast like cultural experience, which I absolutely love, having lived overseas and been overseas when I was younger for many, many years, and how that forms and shapes us. But I do know that you are a spiritual director, a teacher, and a lead pastor of West End Abbey in Winnipeg. That's in Canada, for those of you who don't know. But you're originally from India, and you've lived in 7 countries. Suhail, can you just give us a bio of your life?
Yes, sure. Well, yeah, I was born in India, in New Delhi, and it was somewhat of a rarity in Indian culture to have Christian parents. You know, Christians are really the minority in India. So both of my parents were Christian, came from Christian families. And so about 1.5 years after I was born, I guess they felt a call to be missionaries to a place called the Seychelles, which is near Madagascar. So we were there for 5 years, and then we moved again, I guess, as my parents felt another call to move to Manila in the Philippines. And then finally, after 5 years after that, to Hong Kong, where my parents still live. So we moved there in 1994 when I was about 12 years old.
Wow.
And I went through high school there. I had a gap year before I went to college, which was in Wheaton in the States, just west of Chicago. So after I finished college there, after 4 years, I went back to Hong Kong to work at the same Christian high school that I went to. My mother is a teacher, so she taught English literature at our high school. I had her as a teacher. So after I finished college, I did a double major in philosophy and English literature. And I went back to the same school, and my mom and I were actually teaching partners in the English department for 2 years. And then I came to Winnipeg to do a 6.5-month internship with a community for people at risk of homelessness and for people who wanted to live with people like that. For 6.5 months, I did my master's in Jerusalem for 2 years, kind of in community leadership, nonprofit management, and then came back to Winnipeg in 2012. So Winnipeg is actually Canada's the longest duration of time I've spent in any country of the 7 that you mentioned. So I live here now, and my wife Jennifer and we met here at the church that I was part of, the Vineyard Church. And then we had our 2 kids. So I have a daughter who's going to be 8 this September, and a son who's going to be 5 this July. Yeah, so that's in a nutshell how I've got to where I am now. But
I don't meet that many people that have that much cultural experience, and I'm so fascinated with. Out of the countries that you've lived in, which one do you feel had, and maybe you can't answer, but had sort of the most influential impact on you, and how and why? How does that show up in your life?
Yeah, what a great question. Well, I think in some ways all of them have been very impactful. Some for good reasons and some for more painful reasons. So for example, when we were in the Seychelles, well, that was probably my earliest experience of God. Was I think I even told you and your cohort this past weekend, was we went the Indian Ocean one day after, I don't know, school or something. I must have been 4, preschool, and we'd have barbecues there often, go swimming, and then as the sun was setting, against the backdrop of the sun, way out in the distance, I saw this pod of dolphins kind of arching on the horizon in front of the sunset. And that, I think, was one of my earliest experiences of God, and of oh my goodness, the universe is charmed. You know, there's someone or something much, much bigger and mysterious and maybe even more beautiful than I have ever known. And yeah, I couldn't have articulated at the time what all that was, but I think there was a sense of wonder and awe for me that experience evoked, which of course has impacted the entirety of my life, getting to know this mystery and then realizing there's still so much more mystery to this person, these persons. And then the Seychelles was also a place we were missionaries. And so we were in a largely white missionary compound context. And although I don't know exactly if this was a literal memory or if it was just my perception of things, I know because you're familiar with inner healing prayer, this actually came out for me in an inner healing experience once, where I just had a very vivid experience of being encircled by a bunch of little white kids calling me a dog because of my skin color and whatever, and just pointing at me and saying, "You're a dog, you're a dog." And yeah, I think just the immense amount of shame that brought up for me about being from India, having brown skin, having parents or relatives who looked different or had different kinds of accents. And that I carried with me for probably, I don't know, 20, 25 years, not even really knowing that it was shame because of being from India, having the color of skin that I do. So those are two examples of like how even in one country, in one span of 5 years, having something that positively impacted me for the rest of my life, and then something which was very detrimental to my formation, you know, for 2 decades or something that I didn't even really realize was sort of resident within me for a long time. So I guess I could say in a nutshell, like every one of those countries has had a mixture of great blessing and a great, you know, benefit to me personally or vocationally or whatever. And then, as you can imagine, the other side of the coin is there's also a lot of pain or a lot of hardship that some of those contexts have brought up. So it's all part of the deal, I guess. Great suffering, great love. I think someone said that. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. It's so interesting. And I appreciate you saying that there's a contrast between all these incredible experiences contrasted against really painful, traumatic circumstances as well. And I would imagine that each of those countries also, and it's not even talking about a specific country saying, pointing one out. It's these things can happen anywhere, obviously, but I'd be curious to know if you can recall, because we are talking about spirituality and this is obviously your profession as a spiritual director, teacher, and as a pastor, but your experience of God within the different cultures. And I know I didn't give you this question ahead of time. It's just coming to me now because I'm looking, I wrote down the countries and what or how God presents God's self in these different cultural contexts. Do you have memory of how you experience God in these different places? And if there was a difference, if that makes sense, like how people in Seychelles relate to God as opposed to how they do in Hong Kong or India, or how God is presented in a sense. I'd just love to hear your experience of God in these different places.
It's a great question. To be honest, I don't think I've ever reflected on that in much depth till now. So here we go. Well, as you were asking it, I think for me in the Seychelles, one of the things that I would say was that for me, even if this wasn't intentionally communicated, because of the natural landscape and the geography of where we were, my memory and my perception of spirituality was very embodied and very connected to like nature. So I remember very distinctly, even though I was under the age of 5 or 1.5 to about 5 or 6, like for every Easter Sunday service, we'd all meet at the beach for the sunrise. And so, I mean, the whole enterprise of like having to get up early, go to the beach, watch the sunrise, hearing people sing at the beach. And that was, I honestly don't remember where we met for church, like on a Sunday, what the building was like, but I do have, at least I have an emotional memory of standing at the seashore and watching the sunrise on Easter Sunday, and the singing and maybe the anticipation of seeing the sunrise over the ocean. So for me at that time, at that age, spiritual things or church, prayer, those types of things were very connected to the land and the landscape and where we were. I think I have a memory too of there being a lot of exuberance in terms of, the singing and the way people dressed and all that kind of stuff, and food being a very big part of it. So that's a fun thing for me to reminisce on. Thank you for that question already. I think in the Philippines, that was kind of where I got in touch with my own desire to commemorate certain parts of my spiritual journey. So I remember having a very strong desire to take communion and to get baptized. I also remember in our church, we had like some amazing musicians. Like the music was really awesome during our worship times. My experience of Filipinos were that they were exceptionally gifted singers, and like the band just sounded so good. And I also remember after the services going up on the stage and just banging on the drums there. I never took a single drum lesson, but I remember one day realizing I could play drums. And I think that was in part maybe because of how inspired I was by all the musicianship there, that people tolerated, a 6 to 11-year-old going and banging on the drums. But yeah, I think my experience of that was very much, I guess music was a very big part of that in the Philippines. We were part of a Pentecostal church. It was also the first time I kind of came into contact with like more of the gifts of the Spirit. So a team from Vineyard Canada, ironically, came, I guess, around 1989 or something to Manila. Whereas in the Seychelles and to some extent in the Philippines, faith was kind of out there somewhere. I think in Hong Kong was where it became even more personal to me. So, and that was because I saw other people my age, like teenagers, having a real like hunger and thirst and passion for God, like in and of themselves, aside from their parents simply dragging them to church here and there. Like it was obvious to me that I was now in a group of people who loved God themselves, like for themselves and in and of themselves. And not that I didn't before. I think I've always loved God. But in Hong Kong, it was like the first time I saw people responding intentionally and personally and passionately to the love of God, I guess you could say. And I remember just being so jarred by one of my friends from England saying, he must have been in, I don't know, grade 9 or grade 10. And just off the cuff at youth group one day saying, so I was worshiping in my room and blah, 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 blah. I don't even remember what he said. And I just remember thinking, I didn't even know that was something anyone could do. I thought worship was something we did at the church on Sunday. And so that was jarring, but it was also jarring to see someone who was like my age saying he was doing this by himself in his own bedroom, So I think that was really meaningful to me. We had a pretty, exuberant youth leader who, helped me to learn how to pray in tongues or to receive the gift of tongues, I should say, and just to learn that God could speak personally and I could hear God, I could pray for people and share what I was hearing. And he talked a lot about like our own sexuality, which was very I had no grid for that growing up in church, ironically, that I was an embodied person, that sexuality was relevant to my spirituality. So he would ask very pointed questions of us, which I have some different feelings about that now. But at the time, I just remember thinking, wow, like God is related to this stuff too, So yeah. And then I guess in Wheaton, like that was it was obviously because of the nature of the institution and whatever, like it was very cerebral. And I actually love that in a lot of ways. Since you've probably wondered, I'm a 4 with a strong 5 on the Enneagram. So that whole like researchy study, taking in information thing is it's a very familiar space for me. But I realized, I think in Wheaton, people don't all think the same as me. There was this one person who was in my dorm who was Calvinist. I'd never heard that was even a thing before. And so I think just an appreciation of theological diversity, that struck me in a very deep way in the context of like, higher Christian education in suburban America, with a largely white group of students and whatever. So yeah. And then in Israel, like in Jerusalem, it was very interesting because of the very strong messianic overtones of a lot of faith and Christianity as practiced there. You know, we didn't really talk so much about the resurrection, for example, that was not something I was used to. There was, in my opinion, quite a strong Zionist perspective as well, that a lot of the leaders and the Christian circles that I was in carried with it, you know, and so that was kind of disorienting for me, for sure. I would say specifically the blend of culture and race and religion, that really hit home in a very different way for me when I was in Israel. Yeah. So, and I would say, just in conclusion, like with my initial time in Winnipeg and in my latter time in Hong Kong, it was very influenced by my interactions with those who were poor, those who were on the margins. So in Canada, it was with Indigenous peoples. And in Hong Kong, it was with a lot of people who were street involved, who were addicts, you know, largely heroin addicts, gang involved, with Jackie Pullinger and her work. Yeah. So that I took a lot of time. My parents began going to the vineyard, and so I took a lot of time learning how to go on outreaches and learning how to pray for people. And that was much more of a local Chinese expression of faith. And that was really wonderful. I really enjoyed that. That was a large reason why I ended up coming to Winnipeg, was to see another community and other vineyard communities work with those on the margins. Yeah.
Yeah, gosh, I read her book decades ago. It's like, isn't it called Chasing the Dragon or something?
Yes,
Jackie.
yeah.
And then I found out that was like a drug, and I had no idea. But anyway, like,
yeah, that's right.
But, you know, we're talking, and we could go in two directions. And Kathy, I could ask questions all day, Kathy. So I'm going to give you, we could go.
No, is that
we
true?
We could, because
that never happens.
I was born this way, though. Listen, I used to do radio fake interviews on cassette tapes at like 9 years old, interviewing made up people. And I would either be the interviewee or I would find someone. So this is just part of my DNA. Can't help it, but I do have self-control. I have self-control. I want Jesus is with me. I don't know if you can see that. Anyway, and he's like, he's like, thumbs up, Mel. But I do want to. We could go. We want to cover both. But and what we'll do, Suhail, is we'll break it up. We'll do kind of a distinct pause with the clapper board, you know, and then we'll do it for part 2. So we can either go the direction of spirituality or the direction of Enneagram. Kathy, I'm going to let you input.
Well, I think that based on what we've already heard, it makes the most sense to continue on the spirituality track and understanding what spiritual formation is, what led you into spiritual direction, what that is. It feels like that's a really natural outflow of your life story, because every moment you've had has led you to today and who you are and what you do today. And so I would love to hear more about that. I'm hearing from Melinda as she's learning and growing. It feels very familiar and very different to what I do with the manual approach, but it's a different box, and yet similar in some ways, helping people connect with what's going on inside of them. And, you know, as I'm sure many will have heard this before, just that those levels of maturity and our spiritual growth and formation, it's a process, it's a journey. I don't think anybody ever fully arrives or like all of a sudden, oh, bam, everything's great now. You know, it's about that journey, which you're teaching others to be a presence with others who are walking that. So I think that'd be I'd love to hear more about that. I think our listeners would be very intrigued as well and get to hear more about that, the spiritual dimension of us, because we are spirit beings in an earthly experience, not the other way around. And I think people miss that.
And and if you could address, what does the word spirituality mean to you? And then, as Kathy was saying, even how did you then end up as a spiritual director, and what the heck is that? Because honestly, I'd never heard of it until last year. So the floor is yours, my friend.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think for me anyway, the way that I would understand spirituality is very related to how I understand spiritual direction. So I often tell my students, when we're thinking about spiritual direction, and describing it, that it is really focused on one's current experience of God. And I don't necessarily mean experience as in like a mountaintop. I just mean what is happening in the relationship currently. That's what I mean by experience. So that could be, oh, I feel a great proximity. I feel a great tenderness from God, or I feel God's absence or silence. All of that is what I mean by the word experience. And I also mean by that, like, it's not just what we think about God or even what we think we ought to do relative to our life with God. It's what is actually happening, what is. So I think for me, that would be probably the way that I would personally describe even spirituality, is one's understanding of their current experience of God, or what is happening in their current experience of God. I think that's probably the most simple and elegant way to describe it from where I'm sitting and what I'm trying to do as a spiritual director. So, and I think the reason that that's become increasingly important to me is because I think right from a young age, there was a thirst in me to experience God, to have some sort of relationship with God. And I think I could trace through my life the various ways that I've done that over the years. And I think it was because I had this intuition that God was someone I could know, and God was someone I could love, you know. And then as I journeyed that way, sort of the tables flipped, and I realized, oh, the majority of this is actually about God being someone who loves me and God being someone who knows me. And I think that it sounds like semantics, but it's like a pretty seismic shift in the way that I would understand even spirituality. I think the first part of my Christian journey, no doubt informed by being a Protestant and being in the evangelical stream, was very much, what can I do to make this relationship happen? Or what must I do to make this relationship happen? And then now, and I think this is very informed by the contemplative tradition of our faith, is, well, a lot of it is just learning that God has always been lovingly drawing me and everyone into deeper relationship and experience of God, that it's always at the initiative of God. And God is always, you know, like a seed in the ground that you can go to sleep and you have no idea what happens, and the next day it pops out of the soil. God is always somehow gardening our lives to give us more of a sense of God's love and God's presence in our lives. So I would say, broadly speaking, that was kind of the thing, like a desire to love God and to know God, and then an increasing awareness of how much God wants that for me, myself. God wants to love me. And the first time I heard spiritual direction was actually in Winnipeg. I was living in that community at risk of homelessness, for people at risk of homelessness. And I had a roommate, and just off the cuff, randomly, he said, yeah, I was talking with my spiritual director. This must have been around 2008 or something, 2009. And I remember saying, what is that? I'd never heard that phrase, spiritual director. And his answer was, oh, it's this nun that I meet with, and I talk to her about like my feelings about the economy and whatever else. And I just remember thinking, like, what the heck is that? Like, why would you meet with, I was intrigued by the nun part, but I was like, why would you talk with someone about like how you feel about the economy? Like, how does that have any relevance to your spiritual life? And so that was my first introduction into spiritual direction. Fast forward a number of years, this must have been 2013 or 2014 even. And I had began to hear some rumblings in the vineyard about spiritual direction and spiritual directors. And I had no idea what that meant or what that was, but I remember feeling some sort of like kindling desire. Anytime I heard that word or heard that, you know, there was even a training for spiritual direction, I was like, there was some magnetic pull in my insides towards this, you know. And so I had heard that there was a sustainable faith program. It was kind of founded by some vineyard pastors way back in the day, although it's not a vineyard program per se. And they were running a school in Minneapolis, which is about 6 or 7 hours drive from us here in Winnipeg. And again, I just want to be clear here. I literally have no idea what spiritual direction is, okay? And yet I was considering driving 6 or 7 hours for 5 weekends to go take this training. Okay. And so then I contacted one of the teachers in the program, my friend, a dear friend of mine, Jared Boyd. And he said to me, well, you might want to get a spiritual director before you enter into this 2-year program to become a spiritual director and spend all this money. And he was a spiritual director himself. And so he said, why don't you take like several weeks to think and pray about this and see if you want to move forward with actually receiving a spiritual director, because I had wondered if he might be willing to do that. And well, I took about 12 hours to think about it and then got back to him and said, I'm all in. Like, I want to have a spiritual director. Would you be my spiritual director? And so that was maybe 2013 or 2014, about 10 or 11 years ago. And it was just like, I don't know how else to describe it, except it was like the deepest answer to prayer, to my soul's longing that I didn't even know I had. It was like finding out who God has made me to be. Like, I've always been interested in listening to people's stories. I had thought about, people had wondered, should I go into counseling or therapy? But there was just something about that, like that experience of God, like people's current experience of God, that was so captivating for me that I felt therapy wouldn't satisfy that longing in me. And so I sort of decided there's nothing really here for me. I'll continue leading worship. I'll continue being in the church. I'll continue maybe putting my hand towards pastoral ministry, because I didn't know what else could possibly fit or fill or satisfy this longing I had, until I found spiritual direction. I was like, I get to listen to people. I get to kind of be involved in that somewhat therapeutic environment, but the focus is their current experience of God. How does this even exist? This is too good to be true. And it was so good to be true that I actually wondered if it was God, because up until then, I had only really been formed to discern the invitation of God when it came at great cost to me, when it was something that caused me to suffer. I had no grid for God leading me through my own desire or through joy. And the joy and the desire that was awakened when I found out about spiritual direction was so overpowering that I was like, I don't know that this can be God, because it seems like it's just, I want this so much. How could this be God? So even in and of itself, that was like a really illuminating experience for me, because I mean, as you know, Melinda, like in spiritual direction, we are uncovering people's deep and holy longings as a way to help them understand what God has made them for, who God has made them to be. But I didn't know that. I didn't know that that was a thing till this whole journey with spiritual direction. So I think it was 2014 or 2015, I cobbled together 7 other people from our church at the time to do this first year of training in the School of Spiritual Direction. And Jared came and flew up 5 times, 5 weekends to train us. And I just remember just feeling like this is like who I am. This is the best thing in the world. I cannot believe that I get to do this, And in my own heart too, just feeling like I want to teach this someday too. I want to train spiritual directors myself. And I didn't tell anybody that except Jennifer, my wife, and God, I guess. And so when I finished the 2-year program, we had a different teacher the second year. And as we finished the second year and he was going to offer another school the following year, he asked me out of the blue if I wanted to be sort of his intern. And I was like so floored by that, because I had literally never expressed that desire to anyone except my wife. And like I said, to God. And so it's just such a confirmation that God seemed to want me to do this thing that I wanted, God wanted. So I was an intern for 2 years. And then in 2019, I was asked, I was invited by Sustainable Faith to become one of the teachers. And yeah, so that's, it's amazing to me to feel like I'm 42 at the moment. And so it feels like a great grace to have in the last 10 years already found what I believe is my vocation as a 32, 33-year-old, to feel like God was so kind to show me what was beating in my own heart, and then actually give me like the apparatus or the structure to enact and embody that, is just amazing to me. And yeah, I think I would like to be a spiritual director till I'm like in my 90s. Because I had a spiritual director who was 90, a Jesuit priest, and I was like, if I can be a director like you when I'm 90, I would love that. So yeah, that's kind of a nutshell story of how I've come to spiritual direction.
I just want to kind of highlight back something that you were saying, that your relationship with God or calling on God came in the hard stuff, areas that were forged by pain, and not
Yeah.
realizing that he actually was a friend and wanted to do the good stuff and the fun stuff, wanted you to experience him in that.
Yes.
I think that is a really interesting perspective and point, actually, because so many people, like they say, there's no atheists in foxholes, right? You know, people, when they're in pain, there's trauma, there's fear,
Right.
they're scared, whatever, they're calling out for help, they're turning to God in those areas motivated by pain. And yet there's so much more to that relationship. God wants friendship, relationship. He wants to do the day to day. He wants to celebrate with us. And Melinda in her training will often talk about, with the Emmanuel approach, how, ask Jesus, what's your favorite food? What do you enjoy doing with me the most? What's your favorite color? Things like that we would take for granted in talking to friends about, but yet when it comes to the divine, it's like we only go there when we're freaked out or scared, or
That's right.
there's
Yeah.
trauma. And yet that's helping people step into that day-to-day interaction with Jesus. I mean, that is where there's commonality with what you're doing, what we're doing with Emmanuel approach, is establishing this lifestyle of connection with God. So I thought it was interesting how you said that paradigm shift for you, because I think a lot of people long for that and either don't know that it's possible, or they think they're somehow disqualified, or they don't know how to experience it.
That's right. Yeah.
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 Well,
I was just going to say, in the contemplative tradition, there's this like threefold understanding of the spiritual journey, like it's called the triple way: purgation, illumination, and union. And so I think the purgation part could very well also be like the healing part, although of course this is a lifelong work. But there were so many things that I realized had happened, or that I was carrying, that God needed to heal and to free me from, and including that story I shared about, being a 4 or 5-year-old carrying shame in my body about where I was from. And it would have been near impossible to step into, let alone enjoy, any kind of vocation when I was carrying that level of shame about who I was. So in many ways, I feel like the way God has worked with me to heal and to free and to love me in some of those painful things or those sufferings was to enable me to actually enjoy the thing that I think God made me for. So like, I think we used to say back in the day, like, God saves us from something in order to save us for something. And so my journey with God has been like that. Like, there's been a lot of things that God has had to untangle or free me from or heal me from. And then, there was this moment finding spiritual direction where it was like, oh, this is like a sheer gift that God is giving me that I can now enjoy, because God has taken off some of these burdens and whatever, And again, that's not to say I'm a finished product by any means, but I just wasn't prepared for that experience of joy and satisfaction of desire.
Well, you mentioned the contemplative triple way, which you did mention that the other day on our school, but these listeners didn't hear that. But I'd love to spend just a few more minutes on that, and then we'll carry on. Can you give us a flyover of the contemplative form of Christianity that's not really talked about in the more evangelical or charismatic worlds? And spiritual direction is closely tied to contemplative, and how we begin to notice those small movements of the divine, of Creator God in our life, and maybe tie in like spiritual direction and contemplative practices, if you will.
Yeah. Well, and again, I'm still learning myself all this as well, but the way I kind of understand it is that I think one of the great gifts of the contemplative Christian tradition is the emphasis on the loving work of God to draw a soul into increasing union with God. So, like, this is God's project, and we are invited to cooperate or participate in that project, in our own lives and in our life in the world. And so I think what that means is, like, at the very basic level, just trusting that God is at work shaping and forming us and loving us, regardless of whether we're aware of it. And in some ways, regardless, even if we cooperate in it. I don't mean like that we have no agency or no part to play, but like, God, the love of God is very active and at work in my life, even when I'm sleeping at night, for example. God's presence is around me and with me. Most of the time, I don't even realize that, or I'm not aware of it. So I think the contemplative has been a real corrective, I think, for some of the teeth gritting that I inherited as a young Christian in the evangelical world, that I had to do this all myself, or at least unless I did things, God wouldn't do things. And I think at best, the contemplative it's the gospel. It's like, we love because God first loved us. Like, God is the one who lovingly takes initiative to meet us, reveal God's self to us, to draw us into union with God. And how that happens, there's a lot of things to be said about that. But I think that at the very basic is that is who a loving God is, to take the initiative, to reach out, to draw us in love. And we are called to respond, to participate in that love, but it's not our initiative. And that's a huge shift from the way that I grew up, where I felt like it was all on me, and all the stress and the exhaustion and the guilt that comes from when people can't simply do enough, or feel like, there's too much for them to do in order to have a life with God, right? I think it also relates to like how we pray, of course, like St. John of the Cross, for example, who I'm learning a little bit more about these days. He's just really great at talking about how, like, when we grow in prayer, we might actually find ourselves saying less words, or even desiring to say less words. That makes a lot of sense to me, because, the degree to which you're close to someone on a human level, like a friend or a family member or a spouse or whatever. I remember when my wife, we started dating. We're almost married now, 11 years this June. And when we first started dating, we would, and this is not an exaggeration, would spend like 6 hours on the phone talking to each other a day. And now I think, oh my gosh, like, not only do I not have a desire to spend 6 hours on the phone talking to her, but I feel like what we could communicate in 6 hours, we can communicate in like 6 minutes or maybe 60 minutes. And there's not a need to actually have that communication be entirely verbal or word-based, And so I think with God, the same is true. Like, the whole realm of the contemplative practice is to say that our prayer life changes the degree to which we become more aware of God's love and become more close to God and God's love. Like, we don't actually need to make ourselves heard in the same way. I think Jesus says that, right? Like, don't babble on endlessly, using all these words, thinking that your words in and of it yourself will get you a hearing. It's like, that's a great word for people to think about in terms of contemplative prayer. Like, what do you actually need to say to a God who loves you infinitely and knows you infinitely? Like, what do you actually need to say? A big part of it is just coming into that awareness, like, I am deeply, deeply known. I am deeply, deeply loved. And so I can simply just be with God in prayer. I don't necessarily need to say anything. And I think for me, I find it increasingly hard and undesirable to use a ton of words in prayer. Like, silence has become much more comfortable and welcome for me, partly because what is there to say? Like, I really don't know what to say. Mainly it's trying to just be open to receive whatever God wants to do. Sometimes that's even beneath the level of my mind or my sense, like deep on the level of faith, like, God, you know what I need and what I'm craving. And I just want to simply open myself to you, your presence, your love, the power of your spirit. And you can do that beyond or beneath words, right? And beyond and beneath even my understanding of what's happening. So I think that's kind of also a big part of the contemplative Christian tradition, is like, there's a journey in prayer. There's a journey in how we pray and how we approach God. Yeah, I think, and I just think, like, one of the things I'm super grateful for as well, and this happened even in my training in spiritual direction, is just like the ability to experience God beyond the confines of like my prayer time or a Sunday service, And I see this and I hear this all the time as a spiritual director. Like, people are actually experiencing God all over the place all the time. They just didn't know that it was God. It's like Moses comes to this bush aflame with fire and has no idea that could be an experience of God. And so I think people are often coming into contact with the love of God or the joy of the Spirit or the grace of Jesus in some ways. And they just need to have someone listen to them and reflect that back to them and say, hey, your heart was burning as you were doing that thing, like the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and so I think I'm grateful for that the contemplative has just opened up the avenues in which I can experience God or relate to God or have some kind of window into who God is, So yeah, that's probably some things that I would say that I understand it to be.
So good.
And before we move on, Kathy, is it okay if I ask one more question? I know I want to move on to part 2, but just to kind of give, we kind of like offering some, not action steps, because we don't do that in spiritual direction, but I'm going to say, what are the steps? But for someone new to what you're even talking about or the contemplative practice, if you could offer perhaps, Suhail, some simple first steps that they can begin, that will help them begin to notice God's movement in their daily life beyond I'm in my quiet time or I'm at church in a service.
Yeah. Well, I think something as simple as the Daily Examen, the Ignatian practice of just reviewing your day or a week or a season and noticing, what are the gifts I've received? When did I feel close to God? When did I feel far from God? What's one thing that may be, glowing or shimmering here from my day or season? And what do I hope for? Like, that's essentially the steps of the Examen. That was how I began paying attention to my life, actually. And it's really not a joke, because I have this written down in my journal. Like, I really don't think I would have ever had any awareness of God's invitation to plant a community, a spiritual community, if it wasn't for the Examen. Because as I began practicing the Examen, I would realize, there was something that I felt in this conversation with this person, or I noticed that there was this deep joy or desire when I heard about that thing. What was that, God? So I think the Examen is a really great way to help people experience that God is active in their life in way more ways than they realized. And the other would be to get a spiritual director, to have someone that you can actually talk to about your current life, who can listen to you without judgment or even agenda, and who can ask good questions to sort of tease out, like, what was meaningful to you in this experience you had, and what was your sense of God's presence and experience in the midst of that. I think that's really helpful. And a spiritual director, might beg the question, is really a person who comes alongside you in your spiritual life and journey and experience with God to help you to more clearly discern, the presence and the work and the communication of God in your life, and then gives you space about how you want to respond to those things. So, I mean, all of those things, even just having a compassionate listener is like so great. Having someone ask good questions to help you pique your awareness of things or deepen your discernment of even what's going on inside you is so great. And then someone who can just lovingly help you to discern, like, what is my experience of God right now? What might God be doing in me right now? I think that would be another sort of practical tip, was everyone listening to this should get a spiritual director, and everyone listening to this can practice the examen anytime. As an entry level kind of way. The examen may lose its luster after some time, but it's a great starter.
Yeah.
Well, I certainly concur that everyone should have a spiritual director. Excuse me. I just started meeting with, and I've talked about this in other episodes. I started meeting with one last April, but like last year. And from the first session, it was like, this is what I want to do. I mean, and I didn't even know what it was. Yeah. I had to have her define what it was, and it's been transformative meeting with her regularly. So I agree. Everyone needs to have one. Thank you so much.
All right. Stand by for part 2. Suhail, he's just a very intriguing and lovely person inside and out. And I was very excited to meet him after hearing so much about him from you, Melinda. So we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you for listening or watching.
Thank you for joining us on the Face to Face podcast. For more resources and information, please visit facetofacenetwork.org.
And if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a 5-star review. It helps others discover tools for deeper connection and lasting freedom. We will see you next time.